Hello, everyone. This is the third part in our Introduction to Socionics series. And in the first one, we covered these eight or really 16 information elements, extroverted intuition, introverted ethics, things like that, and their variants. In the second video, we talked about the eight functions that comprise a type, I guess using my own type as a running example. For example, that whatever type EII would have leading FI, creative NE, and so on. I know we didn't get into what an EII is yet. In this video, we'll just sort of talk about what the 16 types are, what their building blocks are. Probably not in great detail or with extreme insight, because there's a lot to say, and those will be topics for other videos. But you could at least get a lay of the landscape, and maybe a better sense of the concepts from the first two videos and how they fit together. So there's a lot of ways to group the 16 types. A fairly natural way is by quadra, but that's a little bit advanced. You can see my other videos about quadra for that. So I think for now, I'll just cycle through the information elements and discuss the types that lead off with them. So I'll go in the same order as I did before, with NE first, because I guess these are my videos. So there's two types with NE first: ILE, intuitive logical extrovert, and IEE, intuitive ethical extrovert. And these type names aren't quite perfect. They're sort of historical clutter. But if you hear intuitive logical extrovert, you can sort of think that intuitive extroversion comes first. That's NE. And then the second part that complements it is this logical introversion, TI. An ILE is really NE plus TI. And IEE is really NE plus FI. When I say NE plus FI, I mean those two are the functions found in that type's ego block. So the NE is leading, and the FI is creative. And from the leading and creative functions, you can sort of read off the other six. And you can do that. You can sort of read off three of them from the leading function and the other three from the creative function. For example, ILE has an NE lead. If NE is the leading function, that means that SE is the role function, this sort of weaker, unvalued two-dimensional function. That SI is a suggestive function, that it's this sort of very weak thing that's being subconsciously or maybe consciously sought after from someone else. And then NI is this seventh ignoring function, something that's strong and unvalued, that's not frequently externalized. So you can sort of think that this role and ignoring function are sort of the two opposites of the leading function, whereas the suggestive function is the complement of it. These information element pairs complement each other. NE complements SI, SE complements NI, FE complements TI, TE complements FI. Why that is, we can get into more later. And it isn't always 100% obvious. But that's that complementation is a big part of the model. So that's the perceiving axis of an ILE. And then there's this other judging axis, because there is TI in the second spot, creative TI. That means you also have vulnerable FI in the fourth spot. And that would be one-dimensional, very weak and unvalued. You would have FE in the sixth spot as this weak and valued mobilizing function. And you would have TE in eighth spot. That's this strong and unvalued very strong and unvalued demonstrative function. Uh, so you can sort of think, the second and sixth functions are the ones that complement each other. You can also think of starting from the very weak, unvalued, vulnerable function, which would be fi for ILE, and the opposite of it, ti, is uh, the creative function, and the alternative to it, this fe, extroverted ethics, is the mobilizing function. So to get IEE, you would do a similar thing. The first axis would be the same. You would have leading NE, role SE, suggestive SI, and ignoring NI. But the other axis would be sort of flipped because they have this creative FI. Then they would have vulnerable TI, mobilizing TE, and demonstrative FE. So if you were to sort of compare the two types, which we can do more in a video talking about kindred types, they would share attitudes toward NE. They would both be defined by this sort of openness, this curiosity, this intellectual novelty, this concern with potential. They would both be defined by their role SE, that they can sort of uh, enter into battles, act decisively, have high activity for a little while, but then eventually going back to this more brainstorming what could be space. That they both have suggestive SI, that they both are sort of looking for this sort of stability, this equilibrium, this being in touch and noticing things with surroundings. And they both have ignoring NI, that's sort of figuring out the one true thing going out under the surface, but fleshing out things in depth to their core, understanding what's really going on here. That's something that happens more privately, and often takes a back seat to this general intellectual expansiveness. Um, those are similarities between the types, and you could do shadings of difference if you split which kind of NE and stuff. But then this other axis, the judging axis, is very different. The ILEs have creative TI. They are very much looking to create order, to create structure, to be consistent, to have rules. While this is not their leading function, so it isn't as prominent as uh, this open-ended space. It's still very much there. Whereas for IEE, it's their vulnerable function. Uh, they are very much allergic to order, allergic to consistency. It can make them freeze when they're really asked to follow a rule, to make a rule, to fit into structure, and that's a big difference. And for FI, it's the other way around. That IEE is fluent in this world of who am I, what do I prefer, uh, who do I prefer, what do I like, can we connect on that basis or not, who do I resonate with. That's something that they can play with. It's not as much, this focus on personal and relational integrity isn't the center of their life like it would be for an FI lead, but it's still very much there. Whereas for ILE, uh, it's the vulnerable function FI, and so uh, that sort of attitude of like, what do I actually want? Who do I actually like? That sort of takes a backseat to this TI stuff of really making things that uh, are more universal, or thinking about people in terms of what did I agree to with this person? What are sort of the rules or principles of interacting with them? And you can also see the differences in this other axis, this other half of the judging functions, that ILE has mobilizing FE, whereas IEE has demonstrative FE. So IEE's FE is four-dimensional. It's very good. Their like dynamic live emotionality is very prominent. It's very effective. They can sort of win over a person or a room. They can really get things out in a good way, but it's also unvalued. It's something that they're really sort of looking to uh, turn into FI. They sort of believe it's overblown. This focus on expression, on getting things out, on energy. They're more looking for what's inside. Uh, so it's better than that of ILE. ILE is very much it's for ILE. FE is two-dimensional and valued. And what that means is that they do care about this expressing things, getting things out. What the energy is, how they come off, while being substantially worse at it. So this, sort of like the IEE is so good that do they even care about it? For TE, extrovert logic, it's the reverse. This is the four-dimensional unvalued demonstrative function for ILE. That it's this thing that can sort of happen easily, is bouncing around their head all the time, thinking about the effectiveness of decisions, thinking about how to execute, about process improvements, about dealing with data. For IEEs, it's weaker, it's two-dimensional, but it's valued. And so, they're more likely to bring that out. Like, let's really make sure we're making a good decision. Like, I'm going to be, doing things that are productive, look at my accomplishments, um, you know, while it being this less natural space for them. So that that was a bit long in breaking down just these two types, but you can sort of see the 8 spots. So to summarize those two, ILE has leading NE, creative TI, role SE, vulnerable FI, suggestive SI, mobilizing TE, ignoring NI, and demonstrative TE. Whereas IEE, intuitive ethical extrovert, has leading NE, creative FI, role SE, vulnerable TI, suggestive SI, mobilizing TE, ignoring NI, and demonstrative FE. So moving on to the NI leads, a similar principle applies. There's two types with NIs, their leading function. You could have NI plus FE in the ego block, or NI plus TE in the ego block. NI plus FE, that's called IEI, intuitive ethical introvert. Whereas NI plus TE, that's called ILI, intuitive logical introvert. So having this NI in the leading function spot, that means that SI is the role function. It means that SE is the suggestive function, the very weak thing that complements it. And that NE, the other variety of intuition, is over in that seventh ignoring spot. So what does that mean? It means that both IEI and ILI, have NI as the core of their identity. That it's very much about finding a narrative, figuring out which way everything is going, figuring out what's under the surface, having this sense of unity in their thought, of depth, of this really coherent and grounded personal approach. So what that means is that it makes SI weak and unvalued as their role function, because their sort of introverted perception, their attention to things, is based on these things unseen, these things behind the curtain. There's less attention left over to give to things that are there, to this SI stuff. But because they are still these introverted perceiving types, there is some attention left over for it. They're not completely terrible with SI. SE, on the other hand, they are very bad at, because it's the opposite of NI. If you are reflecting, if you are pondering, if you're unifying, you are not taking decisive action. You are not, exerting control on your environment. You are not, making things happen and move. And that seventh spot, this sense of what are some new things to consider, what are some different angles, what can I learn about to flesh out this perspective, this approach. That's something that happens, sort of in their head on their own time, privately. Uh, but it's something that serves NI, not something that stands outside of it. So they're very much looking uh, to bring any interesting insights back to the center of how they think, how they are. Otherwise, it's viewed as sort of not very interesting, like, oh, that's just a hobby, that's just a curiosity. And the other axis, the judging axis, is very different between these two types. IEI, intuitive ethical introvert, has creative FE, vulnerable TE, mobilizing TI, and demonstrative FI. Whereas ILI, intuitive logical introvert, has creative TE, vulnerable FE, mobilizing FI, and demonstrative TI. So what does this mean? It means for IEI, FE is a sort of canvas that they very much are looking for some sort of heightened expression, some very vibrant way to get out, what they're going for with all of their NI stuff. That they usually uh, will go out of their way to come off uh, as memorable or interesting. They sort of get how they're being reacted to. They get the kind of energy they're giving off. Whereas for ILI, that's very much a blind spot. They will often ruin the energy, maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally. They will often be unable to produce a certain kind of energy on demand, or to sort of join a vibe. It's an area of great difficulty. Uh, and for TE, extrovert logic, it's the other way around. For ILI, there's sort of connection to what's going on in reality, what is a good decision, what goes well or not, what, how can I be more competent? That's more the canvas. That's more the material for their NI stuff. That they look at what's going on fundamentally under the surface with that uh, you know with these real world happenings. For IEI, it's very hard for them to turn to that, and they may not even want to turn to that. Their world is subjective and personal and social and artistic, and it's not really about uh, you know giving examples, providing evidence for it, like really like being like, I did this for a reason and here's why. Like it's sort of the thing itself is the reason. And you can also see these differences in the mobilizing and demonstrative functions of those two types. um, that uh, IEI is very good with the nuances of people's identity and relationship, sort of telling uh, what people may internally want, sort of tracking all of that. Whereas, but it's unvalued, so they'll often play with it to get the kind of expression, the kind of feeling that they're looking for. Um, and for ILI, it is valued, but it's weak. So they really do more want to uh, have this stability of preference. They really do want to see inside to uh, what is this person's real longings. But they it's just they can't do it quite as well. And for TI, introverted logic, it's the reverse. IEIs with TI as their mobilizing function, they desire to be systematic, to make sense, to really have things cohesively structured. uh, but sometimes do this haltingly, whereas ILIs can do this near effortlessly, but they desire to convert this TI into TE, that their systematic approaches are only worth something if they're really doing something out there in the world, if they're leading to results. Um, so those are our NI leads. Next, we have the SE leads: SLE, sensory logical extrovert, and SEE, sensory ethical extrovert. So those types have SE as their leading function, so they have NE as their role function, NI as their suggestive function, and SI as their ignoring function. So this means, that the core of their personality is their ability to make an impact, to be active, to really just respond well in the moment, in concrete situations, and that shoves out NE, which is more about uh, what could we be doing, and how might that go, and what are all the different ways to think about this. That competes for space with acting immediately, so that's something that they can do for a little while to make sure their action is right, but it's an unnatural mode and they'll snap back. Uh, and because they are being active, they are not necessarily being reflective. They may be missing what's really behind things. What is the why behind what they're doing? Uh, feel like it's all sort of going nowhere, and they're just doing stuff. So that's this NI suggestive, shared by both SE lead types. Uh, and then this alternative version of sensing, SI, is their ignoring function, because they are, sort of having this expansive way to live their life of doing more, of uh, controlling space, of really, living each moment to the fullest. Um, they are not just, always checking in with their body, being like, am I comfortable? Do I like this? Um, do I want to stay here? That's something where if they really thought about that stuff, they could have some measure of effectiveness, but it's often uh, just something that's, they'll lean on when appropriate, but would prefer to be continuing to push forward. Whereas the other axis, the judging axis, is different, similarly to how it's different for ILE and IEE. So SLE has this creative TI, and creative TI implies vulnerable FI, mobilizing FE, and demonstrative TE. Whereas SEE is the other way around. They have creative FI, vulnerable TI, mobilizing TE, and demonstrative FE. So SLE is very confident in this area of creating order in this reality that they're acting so much on, and really making sure that everything is in their place and everyone is doing their assigned role, and there's not so much ambiguity. For SEE, that kind of stuff is their enemy. They want to act freely. They really want others to act freely. They're confident that they can win in that area. And this idea that they need to stop and be like, no, you can't do that because someone wrote something down on a piece of paper once and they may not even be here. It's like, that's stupid. I just want to do some stuff. Like, get out of my way. For FI, it's the other way around. It's SLE who's scarier. That SEE is very good at noticing affiliative tendencies between people, at building affiliation, at bringing people closer or farther. It's sort of acting in accordance with what they like and what they want, at telling what others want. For SLE, this is really a problem. They're often accused of not seeing people, not really noticing what's inside of them. That they just sort of will push for their order and their rules and their desired result, and just sort of miss things. And then in terms of mobilizing and demonstrative, the sixth and eighth functions is similar again to ILE and IEE. But SLE very much desires this strong emotional impact. Think of someone standing on a giant stage and being like, "Are we excited to be here?" And the people who don't value FE are just like, "All right, maybe." But SLE really, really wants that reaction, really wants to get things out, really wants to know by emotional energy that things are going right for them. Whereas SEE can do that stuff much more easily, but view it as a bit beside the point. They're looking more at uh, what is the connection behind this energy, what is the stabler relational reality behind it. And it's the opposite for extroverted logic. SEEs really want to make sure that they're being productive, that they're achieving the right goals, that they're becoming more efficient, that they're controlling resources well. Whereas for SLE, it's demonstrative, it's four-dimensional. This is much easier for them, but their ultimate goal is to get this solid TI order from it. That they're in the moment rational choices, and they're in the moment concern with quality execution tends to go toward that sort of end rather than as an end in itself. So those are the SE leads. For the SI leads, we have SI plus FE and SI plus TE. So we have SI plus FE, that's called sensory ethical introvert, SEI, and SI plus TE, that's sensory logical introvert, SLI. Both of these types will have leading SI, role NI, suggestive NE, and ignoring SE. So they're the primary thing on their mind is going to be this SI stuff, this connection with their body and surroundings, this attention to detail, this sense of equilibrium and sometimes inertia, this sense of place and sensory memory and sensory preference. Uh, and that is going against the other kind of introverted perception, NI, that, being there, fully there in the moment with what's around you means that you're not going to leave the moment to go work on some sort of more disembodied personal vision or unified personal take on things. Uh, which is why NI is only two-dimensional and unvalued. Uh, and NE is this sort of very weak opposite of SI. For SI, what's in front of you is sort of what there is. It's the thing on your mind by default. Uh, Whereas for NE, it's about everything else that could be starting from that thing in front of you. So it's uh, to overcome this sense uh, of inertia, of stasis, of sort of not getting out of a bubble. These NE impulses are sort of needed from the outside to balance it out. That we could do things another way. We could try something else. Here are some low key suggestions that may be rejected, but are still have this opening effect. And then they have SE as the ignoring function. That they're able to take action, to exert energy, but it tends to be something that's in service of this equilibrium, of this nice balance with the surroundings. If something's off balance, then it's time for exertion, but you don't want to uh, exert past the balance. That just feels wrong by the core value of SI being first. And as usual, and as with the NI leads, these two types are very different from each other in the judging function axis. So SEI has creative FE, which means they have vulnerable TE, mobilizing TI, demonstrative FI, whereas SLI has creative TE, which means they have vulnerable FE, mobilizing FI, demonstrative TI. So you sort of see that SEIs, while going about their sort of SI reactions to things, that's often expressed in some sort of emotion. They sort of get uh, the energy that's coming from their surroundings. They can, put energy back into their surroundings if there's other people in it. That this is all this very natural sort of game. Whereas for SLIs, sort of the less things feel loud, uh, the better, and that often even goes into design choices like, too many colors, too much stuff, like uh, tone it down, be subtle, be classy. Uh, Sort of don't know what to do when strong emotions happen. For TE, it's the other way around. SLI is very much, ergonomics is a good word for SLI. They're really making sure that everything in their environment uh, works well, is sort of this pleasingly effective thing, that it feels, modern, uncluttered, uh, like non-wasteful. Uh, Whereas for SEI, that's it's not. They don't like to think about that stuff. Is this all in the optimal formation? Like, were all the decisions made well? Like that. It's they don't really want to be in this state of rethinking, of measuring, of reality checking. That's something that can easily make them shut down. Uh, and we can also look at the mobilizing and demonstrative functions for those two types. Um, that uh, SEIs sort of desire this TI coherence, consistency. Sort of having these good rules of how people should behave or how to interact with the world. But they're sometimes a little bit poorly formed. SLI is confident in this area, but they're looking to turn TI into TE. Any rule should be there to be effective. Any opinion should be an opinion that leads to something beneficial. Uh, and for FI, it's the opposite. SEIs uh, like do understand what they want, what they prefer, how they are oriented to different people, and that same thing in others. They can assess the state of a bond, or the state of their own heart. SLIs want to do this, but it's suppressed a bit behind all this sort of drier logic. But it is, taken very seriously to have this sort of uh, dry or emotional background of like, what, who am I, and what do I really want, and what is it to be a person. That is taken more seriously, and definitely not as something that leads into FE. So those are the two SI lead types. I guess this video will be a bit longer than I expected, but that's okay. We're taking a tour through all 16 types. So we would continue past these perception lead types. We've described, these 8 perceiving or irrational types with a, intuitive or sensing function first. Now we get to these 8 rational or judging types, uh, that has logic or ethics first. So let's start with the FE lead types, extroverted ethics. So that would be EIE, ethical intuitive extrovert, and ESE, ethical sensory extrovert. Uh, so both of these types would have FE as the leading function. So they have TE as the role function, TI as the suggestive function, and FI as the ignoring function. So that means that they engage with the world, through this this emotional energy through this ability to create atmosphere or the desire to express a feeling, through seeing people's moods and affecting people's moods, that's just a primary mode, that's something that's really important. And that means that it sort of crowds out TE if you're really like judging the effect of your actions based on the energy it creates. Then you're not evaluating that same situation from this more detached perspective of like what were the results and did it uh, go well. It's something that they can do, and in fact, it's something that can sometimes support a leading FE, but they would really, their own sort of feelers, in the colloquial sense, like their reads of these energies is a much better orienting thing, and they would orient by it to the extent that modern society allows them to. Uh, and so TI would be their suggestive function because it's this complement uh, of FE. It's this sort of uh, conversation, like either you're looking at truth, like at very literal truth. Does this follow this principle? Yes or no? Or you're looking at energy, like did that, you know, sort of put this better or worse affect out in the world, and that uh, because they're zoned in to this to these flows all the time. It's harder to be like, what if that flow didn't exist? Like, did A still equal B? Of course, they can do math, but it's just not something that comes out moment to moment. That they're not like thinking about situations in terms of uh, these real, these consistent, these lasting shoulds and shouldn'ts. But they need that because otherwise it'll just be this explosion of energy in whichever direction seems to be right at the moment. Immature FE leads are like that, but mature FE leads will often assimilate this TI, this sense that like there is a grounding. There are things that I believe and don't believe. There are ways that I will and won't act, and that is this appropriate vessel through which my expression can really shine. Um, and then the ignoring FI, that this because they are listening so much to this dynamic emotional current inside themselves, as well as dynamic emotional current around them. It's hard to shut that off and just be like, what is my actual stable uh, emotional inclination toward this person? Do I really? They're so attuned to emotions in general. They can do this stuff, but it's not their natural starting point. So the two different FI leads then have very different. Sorry, the two different FE leads have very different perceiving axes. So EIE has creative NI, vulnerable SI, uh, mobilizing SE, and demonstrative NE, whereas ESE, ethical sensory extrovert, has creative SI, vulnerable NI, mobilizing NE, and demonstrative SE. So what this means is that EIE, their expression is sort of driven through these more abstract narratives, through their perspective on things. That's the area that they feel comfortable working in just like this area of sort of what is your mental and personal reality. What does it consist of? Is it cohesive? Is it meaningful? Is it purposeful? Whereas for ESE, that kinds of question sort of throws them off. They're much more comfortable in the moment, experiencing things, enjoying things, doing the best they can. It's being constantly in this what is my purpose, and what's going on underneath here, is this foreign element to their personality. Whereas for SI, it's the other way around. ESE very much drives their emotional energies through their surroundings. They will often give it this form of sensory expression in terms of what is this person experiencing in an SI way? Are they comfortable? Are they at ease? Do they find this jarring? For EIE, you sometimes get the sense of a person who doesn't quite live on Earth. Uh, that just being this person in a body in a house, who has to eat, who gets sick, that this sort of takes them uh, off of their sort of exalted quests. That's where they're most comfortable, uh, and it just seems like, oh gosh, like this stuff. How do I deal with it? In terms of the mobilizing and demonstrative, EIE really wants to think of themselves as this doer, as this active person, as someone who really gets stuff done. But as an intuitive type, they are in their heads, they're more contemplative. It falls short. Whereas ESE can do that kind of thing fairly effortlessly, but they want to turn it into SI. The purpose of their action, of their dynamism, is to help create more of this equilibrium and this stasis. They are not committed to this idea of motion, of dynamism, like EIE is, even though they are better at it. And the opposite is true for NE. ESE is very interested in new ideas, and different perspectives, and experiencing different things, and thinking about things in new ways. But it often seems a little bit overexcited, or on the surface, or sometimes they miss a little bit of the point or the grounding of what the idea was with their weak NI and TI. But it excites them. Whereas EIE picks up on this stuff better. Usually, they really understand like the different concepts floating around, and all the other concepts that come out of them. They sort of understand all the possibilities open to them and to others, but they want to turn it into NI. They really want, they want this unity, this cohesiveness, this one forward direction instead of random jumping off points. So in that sense, it's not valued. As that demonstrative function is not valued. So those are the FE leads. Next, we get to the FI leads. We have the ethical sensory introvert, ESI, and they have FI plus SE in their ego block. And then we have the ethical intuitive introvert, EII. They have FI plus NE in their ego block. So both FI lead types will have leading FI, role TI, suggestive TE, and ignoring FE. So the leading FI, the sort of integrity of their own sense of self, of their own gut preferences, of their own, sense of where am I in this more stable web of relations, and what is the effect I want on it. Uh, that is the core of the thing that's on their mind much of the time. That means that because they have this form of judgment, this form of ethics operating, the other form of judgment or ethics, TI, is put off to the side a bit as the role function. That they're really making these evaluations based on what do I want, who am I, do I like this, am I okay with this, does this feel right? So it's not so much like, does this match principle X? Like, is this consistent with my value system? Like, they may have one, and they may say they have one, but it isn't really going to be so literal, so almost algorithmic, as it would be for the very consistent TI leads. TE is going to be their suggestive function. It complements FI. Uh, FI is subjective. TE is objective, which isn't to say, that their TE leads aren't biased. Uh, but you're either dealing with a situation you're dealing with a situation as a person, as someone with a stake in it, as someone who wants things, as someone who prefers things, or you're participating in this situation from this outside perspective. Like, what am I trying to do? Is this going to work? Is that going to work? And really sort of leaving themselves so much to participate in that situation is going to be hard. For FI leads, they need guidance that they can accept if they find it personally resonant, and reject if they don't. And then FE would be the ignoring function, because their emotionality is of this inward, of this more stable, of this deeper variety. They don't have as much interest in sort of getting out the emotionality of just a moment, and they don't have as much interest in the sort of back and forth passing of emotional flow between people. They can do it. They can often do it well, but it seems like it's not the real. It's not real. It's transitory. It's on the surface. Let's consider what's at the core. But these two FI lead types are quite different in what happens in their other functions, their perceiving functions. So ESI has creative SE, which means they have vulnerable NE, mobilizing NI, and demonstrative SI, whereas EII has creative NE, vulnerable SE, and mobilizing SI, and demonstrative NI. So for EII, their emotional core is sort of something that's meant to expand through a sort of personal openness, that they want to explore new angles on themselves, that they're sort of interested in finding new ways to interact with others, to find sort of win-win approaches to conflicts, to find commonalities, to sort of, build this set of people they can interact with. Whereas ESI, NE is vulnerable. So these sort of change and novelty in their personal patterns of thought and being is viewed as more of a threat. People are usually not trusted by default. They're also just less likely to want to unearth stuff from within themselves, because it's sort of, who knows what you might find. Whereas for SE, the situation is more reversed. ESI is very comfortable backing up their personal convictions in actions. If they want something or someone, they can make it happen. If they think someone has done something bad, they can push the person away, or to the extent necessary, they can really, hold firm on things, and really just, push through until they have what they want. For EII, this is more of a foreign element for their personality. SE is their vulnerable function. They will often sort of have these high personal ideals, and then they can't reach it. And then there's just sort of, maybe walk away and be quietly sad. If they do confront someone about something, which they can, because their FI is very important, it may just be sort of more like I'm disappointed. How could we work this out? I was hurt. Uh, it's not going to be this more insistent thing, oppressive streak, because that kind of world stubbornly persists. In terms of mobilizing and demonstrative functions, EII has mobilizing SI. They very much sort of are interested in the pleasing and attributes of day-to-day life, just in these small and detailed and grounded things. They can sort of be fussy or picky about that kind of stuff. They can be very proud of themselves if they get it right. Um, whereas ESI, this is much more effortless. They are very much attuned to what's going on in their surroundings and its effect on people. But they want to turn that SI into SE. They don't want to sit around and enjoy things and always make sure everyone's comfortable. They really want to push toward their desired ends. For NI, it's the other way around. ESI really sort of wants this unifying perspective, this take on things, this sort of grounding ideology and meta truth. Whereas EII, that stuff is very natural. There tend to be a reflective person who is comfortable in their heads, untangling their own thoughts, understanding what's behind them. But ultimately, they're looking to turn that NI into NE. Their sort of deeper insights into a situation are meant to open the situation up, to lead to sort of new avenues, to greater hope, not to just be there as something that always will be, and is this beautiful fixed thing as NI sort of longs to be this big overarching thing, whereas ESI, uh, they will sometimes believe they have this one true narrative, and it'll be a little too simple. So those are all the ethical types. So the only types that remain are the four logical lead types. We start with the TE lead types. So there's a logical intuitive extrovert, LIE, and logical sensory extrovert, LSE. So LIE has TE and NI in their ego block, whereas LSE has TE and SI. So having TE as the leading function means that they have FE role, FI suggestive, and TI ignoring. And this has some overlap with some other things we've discussed in this video. So the core, their identity, is their ability to make rational and productive decisions and to execute on them rationally and productively. This means that the other kind of engagement, FE, falls off a bit in comparison, because they understand what goal they're directed toward, what they have to do. They're focused on that. They're not focused on what is happening to them emotionally. They're not focused on what is happening to others emotionally, but they can switch to that mode for a bit. FI is as the complement of TE is their suggestive function. It is their need to really be able to be in a situation from the inside, to understand that they are a person who wants things, who prefers things, who has this subjective sense of what is and isn't okay. That's not something that they're really going to develop naturally. It's something that they sort of need to be led to, as well as to just see that in others. And that also means that TI is their ignoring function, because their thought process is so much oriented at results and at reality. It's they're a little bit less inclined to turn that thought process in on itself, to sort of organize its foundations, uh, or in the case of the sensory variants, to you know, there's so much trying to do the next thing that they're not necessarily as much looking at, like, am I doing this in an ordered way, that I, how will I do this the next time? That's something that they can do, but only once it becomes really necessary, once it's really starting to block them from doing the next thing, from making progress. Um, so the perceiving axis is going to be different for these two types. LIEs have creative NI, vulnerable SI, mobilizing SE, and demonstrative NE. And for LSEs, as with the ESEs, they have creative SI, vulnerable NI, mobilizing NE, demonstrative SE. So LSEs are very much, into being productive in real things, at really, you know, arranging real materials well, making the right choice to deal with the next thing that's actually in front of them, really sweating all the details. For LIEs, uh, they don't come off quite as disconnected as EIEs, but they very much have this more productive vision. Which way are things going? And being really inside the flow of what's going on, really having to look at stuff, really having to be precise and careful, uh, and especially just being able to stop the productive momentum and rest for a little. This is all very hard for the LIE. Uh, it starts to just be like, oh, like maybe I need to tone down my my sense of what I should do next, because there's all this annoying stuff to do. For NI, it's the other way around. LIE is very much uh, looking at which way things are headed. Um, so therefore, what is appropriate to do right now? Is this going to work or not? Why might I think it's going to work? And they sort of have this cohesive sense of what they're doing and why, that can sort of lead to a well-defined internal sense of what their mission is, what it means to be on track toward it. For LSEs, it's much harder to take a sort of step back and do that sort of reflection that any NI ego type would do naturally, because their natural habitat, what is most pleasing, is really making this concrete progress in real work, thinking task to task, really, like, uh, making it all work in a pleasing flow. For mobilizing and demonstrative, LIEs mobilizing SE, they sort of really want to think of themselves as someone who can push, who is tough, who has a lot of stamina and willpower, but they are ultimately more brainy than doers. LSEs are doers, but they're also looking to turn SE uh, into SI. So they're not just pushing for the sake of pushing. They're trying to make sure that there's a rhythm, that everything's well balanced. In terms of NE, LSEs are very interested in new ideas, and new approaches, in almost just sort of whimsical things, as well as in developing themselves. But that sometimes stays surface level because they are more focused on the details, on the reality, on the execution. For LIEs, uh, they are much more aware what opportunities they're being presented, what they or others may be capable of, vetting ideas, but they want to sort of prune them down into NI. They really want to bring them back to the main productive threads of what they're trying to do and why, and why it's important. Um, so that's the TE leads. For the TI leads, you have LII, logical intuitive introvert, and LSI, logical sensory introvert. Um, and for LII, that means they have TI plus NE in their ego block. And for LSI, TI plus SE in their ego block. So both of these types have leading TI, role FI, suggestive FE, and ignoring TE. So TI really means that they're all about having the right internal rules and principles, really trying to structure their reality explicitly through consistent and universal approaches that can be applied without exception. They don't always achieve this, but it's what they're going for. It's what's always uh, sort of around in their heads. Things feel incomplete until they are crystallized and made complete into systems. And because this sort of morality, this sort of more universal and written down sort of morality is so prominent for them. The other kind of morality, FI, uh, where you are just acting out of being a person, out of wanting things, not wanting things, not being things. That's something that they can tap into for a little, but it's like, okay, so now I did this. So what is the more universal thing I should think or thing I should do that encapsulates this, and that their ethics always go back to something like that. Um, FE is their suggestive function, uh, because they're operating in this more detached way of oughts and shoulds and rules and universality. Really, just joining it as a participant, as someone who's expressing energy, as someone who's receiving energy, is harder, but it's something that they can be drawn into. And in fact, it's something that gives them better rules because they can really see uh, the the live effects that it has on people, how much it resonates or not with people's emotionality. That's always usually on, though it's not on much often for TI leads. And then they would have TE ignoring. They do want to flesh out their systems, their ordered approaches. With real examples. They want to make sure that they work, that everything is in right place, that it's sort of real. But this sense of doing things effectively, of achieving goals, it's not really that interesting, except in the context of this. What is my process, and having like the perfect process that always works. That's interesting. So productivity in that context can be something TI leads are interested in. Um, Whereas the other axis, the perceiving axis, is very different between the two types. For LII, they have creative NE, vulnerable SE, mobilizing SI, demonstrative NI. LSIs have creative SE, vulnerable NE, mobilizing NI, demonstrative SI. So LIIs, uh, they are forming their systems. They very much look outwards in that process. What are all of the things that I need to unify together? Uh, let's look at this phenomenon and that one and combine them. And is this really universal? No, it isn't. Let's go back to the drawing board a bit. And they really want to synthesize a bunch of stuff into this uh, perfect TI structure. Uh, Whereas LSIs, this outwardness, this considering new things, it's viewed as more of a threat. They want to keep it fixed. They don't. They will often not adjust gracefully if they have to rethink things. If especially the more fundamentally it has to be rethought, the more stressful it gets. Whereas for SE, LSIs really effectively can back their ordered and structured approaches up in action. They can make sure that the order is real, that things are kept inside the lines, uh, that their preferred systems and yeah, their principles are really advanced and spread and concretely adhered to. For LII, this is hard. LIIs are often into things like natural rights, human rights, equality, freedom, liberty, all these things. Principles meant to apply without exception. It's like, should I really force someone to do something, even if I believe this is true? Um, they go into this NE mode. Do I really have the right to do this, to say this? Uh, I can act when I believe that it's perfectly justified, with this web of logic going inside my head. In practice, that means that the time to act is often never. Um, in terms of the mobilizing and demonstrative, LIIs value SI. They really want to make sure to get all the details right. They want to make sure that everything is smooth and sort of nice. But they're very much in their heads, and so really paying the amount of attention that's necessary can be hard for them because of that. Whereas LSIs, their SI is pretty effortless, but they desire to turn it into SE. They want their attention to detail to be aimed at some sort of forward momentum, to be something that's acted on. And NI, it's the other way around. LSIs really want to make sure that there's this coherence, this grounding, this philosophical deeper truth in what they're up to. But they just will more often get bogged down in details and specifics, and sometimes only reach a surface level one. LII is much more comfortable going deep, reflecting, sitting with their ideas. But in the end, they are not as much looking for this one true perspective behind everything. They're more looking to deepen a bunch of different perspectives, but have it grow outwards. Having their ideas grow outwards is a good thing. All right, so that's all 16 types. You can sort of see these 8 different elements can be the leading function, and then there's 2 variants of each. For example, TI plus NE and TI plus SE. And you've sort of seen on the surface level what's going on in all 8 spots with these different types. So that concludes this segment of video. Thank you.